The monsoon announced itself as a promise that the sky would not keep. Over the Lalbagh Palace in Murshidabad, the air hung like damp silk, heavy and impenetrable, and in the mango groves beyond the walls, not a leaf stirred. It was May, and Bengal awaited the rain. The Persian watchmaker knelt before the Nawab, his hands trembling despite the warmth of the night. Resting on the velvet cushion in his palms was the chronometer, no ordinary piece, but a marvel of mechanics that bore two faces. One showed the familiar Roman numerals carried by the English in their ships across the oceans. The other, framed by filigree miniature paintings of a peacock and a lotus, followed the older rhythm of the Mughal era, which was already fading before it had entirely passed. On the silver lid gleamed a verse by Saadi, engraved in flowing Persian: "The moment passes, but what it holds remains." Siraj-ud-Dawla, 23 years old, and Nawab of Bengal for barely a year, regarded the watch without touching it. His face, young and already marked by mistrust, reflected in the polished casing. Somewhere beyond the palace walls a dog barked, then fell silent. The Nawab did not lift his gaze from the watch as a servant stepped through the silk curtains and whispered something in his ear, so softly that even the watchmaker could not understand. "The Englishmen have moved their troops from Calcutta," said the Nawab, more to himself than to anyone else. His voice carried no fear, only a strange weariness. He finally took the clock in his hand, and its ticking, barely audible, filled the silence between them like a second, slower heartbeat. The watchmaker did not dare to raise his head. He heard the Nawab rise, footsteps on the marble, then silence. When he finally looked up, the room was empty save for the scent of rose oil and the first gust of the monsoon, which swept through the open windows and billowed the curtains like sails before a storm. The man who called himself Tariq awoke before dawn, as always, in his small chamber near the palace kitchens, which was more of a store cupboard than a dwelling, hung the smell of old ink and the acrid smoke of the oil lamp he had burning all night. For 26 years he had survived by making other men's words his own. He washed with water from the clay jug and pulled on the clean muslin he could afford because he worked for both sides. The East India Company paid him in rupees, the Nawab in promises of land that were never redeemed. Both believed they owned him. Both were wrong. On his narrow desk lay books he had gathered over the years, a corpus of Persian poetry, a yellowed English Bible exchanged by a drunkard company clerk for a night's lodging, and a self-bound manuscript of Bengali folk tales, which he collected to one day read to his daughter. His wife had died in childbirth 3 years prior. The child lived with his sister on the outskirts of the city, and Tariq visited once a week when his work permitted. Usually it did not. He reached for the small portrait leaning against the wall above his desk, a clumsy pencil sketch he had made himself. His wife's face was already fading from his memory. The drawing preserved it, perhaps inaccurately, but present. Beside it, carved into the wood of the window frame, were 3 letters, his daughter's name, which he never spoke aloud, fearing he might betray it. His hands were slender but strong, scribe's hands which held pen and paper for 10 hours a day and, at night, when sleep did not come, plucked the strings of an old setter he had received from his father. A man from Bristol who had impregnated a Persian merchant's daughter and then abandoned her. The only things he had left Tariq were his fair skin and the ability to learn a language as if it were a key. One only had to insert into the right lock. Persian, Bengali, English, 3 tongues, and not a single one in which he could speak the truth without betraying himself. He stepped to the window and looked down upon the awakening city. On the street below, a caravan passed, camels laden with silk and salt, while men in the red coats of the company's sepoys marched alongside. Tariq observed them without squinting, a habit ingrained in his flesh and blood. He saw what others overlooked. That Mir Jafar's servants took the route to the British camp with conspicuous frequency. That the Nawab slept less than his court believed. That a spider always weaves its web where 2 walls meet. He himself was that spider, he thought, as he adjusted his turban and stepped towards the door. Only he did not know in whose web he was actually trapped. The room they called the Palace Archive was in truth a windowless chamber behind the audience hall, stuffed with dusty scrolls, yellowed trade contracts, and the leather file folders the company used for its correspondence. Tariq sat at a low table cataloging the customs documents of the previous year, an endless litany of bales of silk, barrels of saltpeter, and crates of opium, every line a silent indictment of Bengal's slow bleeding. The afternoon heat stagnated beneath the low ceiling. Tariq had removed his turban and rolled up his sleeves. Beads of sweat ran down his forearms and blurred the fresh ink on the paper. He heard two palace servants arguing outside in the corridor, then footsteps receding, then silence. The door opened, so softly that only the faint click of the latch betrayed it. A man stepped in, whom Tariq recognized immediately, Rashid, a messenger from Mir Jafar's household, a gaunt Bihari with a burn scar on his chin and eyes that never stayed still. Rashid did not see Tariq. He believed the room to be empty, for Tariq was seated behind a stack of dusty folios that nearly concealed him completely. Tariq held his breath. His first instinct was to make himself known. His second, stronger instinct commanded him to remain still and observe. Rashid moved purposefully to a wall cupboard, stuffed with blind silver mirrors and useless objects, and reached behind a dented copper pitcher. Tariq knew the secret compartment. He had discovered it months ago, empty save for a dead spider. Now he watched as Rashid slid a sealed leather pouch inside, glanced hastily around, and left the room as hurriedly as he had entered. For 5 heartbeats, Tariq did not move. Then, as the footsteps faded, he rose as quietly as he could and approached the cupboard. The pouch was heavy, the seal made of red wax, but clumsily impressed, not an official state seal press, but a simple ring. He hesitated for only a moment, then broke the seal with his thumbnail. The message was written in a cipher he could not immediately read, but he recognized the hurried, careless handwriting of a company scribe he knew, William Watts, the head of British intelligence. A man who never delivered letters himself, if a Bihari with a scarred chin could do it for him. Tariq took a deep breath. Then he sat back down at his desk, pulled a fresh sheet of paper towards him, and began to transcribe the foreign characters, every single one, as if through the careful copy alone he could force their secret to reveal itself. The tent smelled of tobacco, sweat, and the damp wool blankets that never properly dried in the monsoon climate. Robert Clive, 32 years old, and already a lieutenant colonel of the East India Company, sat on a camp chair that had once belonged to a French commander, turning a small globe in his hands. He listened without looking. William Watts, his head of intelligence, a pale man with ink still under his fingernails, had spread the contract out on the folding table. 3 copies, one for the company, one for Mir Jafar, and one for the archives, which no one would ever open. The negotiator, an elderly Bengali with a dyed beard and the manners of a man who considered himself indispensable, spoke of loyalty, terms, and the 30 lakh rupees his master expected. "He gets the throne," said Clive, without looking up from the globe. His finger paused on Bengal. "Is that not enough?" Watts jotted down something no one could read. The oil lamp flickered, casting shadows on the tent walls, behind which the sepoys stood guard, silent and unaware. The agent smiled thinly and spoke of guarantees, of the treasury of Murshidabad, which must be distributed after the battle. Clive set the globe aside. "Tell your master that he must do his part. At the decisive moment, he holds his troops back. No intervention, no cavalry, no cannon. The Nawab must believe he is abandoned, and he will be." He said it as if explaining the rules of a game to a child. Watts slid the contract across the table. The agent hesitated, then dipped his quill into the inkwell and signed. The name Mir Jafar appeared on the paper like a curse not yet spoken. When the man had left, Clive leaned back. The globe still turned, more slowly now. "Here the empire is born, Watts. Write that down. Watts wrote it down. Outside, beyond the camp, the monsoon gathered, heavy and black, and waited. 3 days and 3 nights. That was how long Tariq had gone without sleep, or rather without proper rest, only in fragments that jolted him awake from dreams he immediately forgot. His chambers smelled of cold tea and the acrid smoke of the oil lamp, the wick of which he had had to replace 3 times. The copy of the letter lay before him, alongside a battered codebook he had stolen 2 years prior from the estate of a deceased company translator, a precaution he had never imagined he would need. The cipher was simple, but laborious. Each number stood for a letter. Every 3rd line was dummy text, and the order of the paragraphs followed a key he only discovered on the 2nd night, hidden in the initial letters of the seemingly innocuous trade notes in the margin. Watts had been thorough, but not thorough enough. On the 3rd night, as the monsoon finally threw its first heavy drops onto his flat roof, the final fragments fell into place. Tariq stared at the sheet he had written on and read the sentence that contained everything. The troops of His Excellency Mir Jafar will hold back during the engagement. The Nawab will be isolated. Clive expects victory before noon. His hands trembled, and for the first time in days, it was not exhaustion. He read on, of 30 lakh rupees, of the state treasury that was to be distributed, of a village called Plassey where the armies would meet. Clive had only 3,000 men. The Nawab had 50,000, but the numbers no longer mattered. Not when half the army obeyed the order not to fight. Tariq leaned back. The rain was now lashing harder. He thought of the Nawab holding the clock with the 2-faced dial in his hands, and of the servant who had whispered the news of the English troops into his ear. He should have been warned. He just did not know that the danger did not come from the English, but from within his own ranks. If Tariq handed over the letter, they would ask him where he had obtained it. They would expose his double role, arrest him, execute him. If he remained silent, the Nawab would ride into a trap from which there was no escape. He folded the paper together, very slowly, and pushed it into the pocket of his robe. Outside, a bolt of lightning tore through the sky over Murshidabad, and in its light Tariq saw his reflection in the window, a man who had never made a decision for anything, because survival did not allow for choices. Now there was no survival, only a choice. The Diwan-i-Khas was that morning a cage of silk and mistrust. Tariq stood among the petitioners, pressing against the walls, waiting for a glance from the Nawab that never came. Siraj-ud-Dawla sat upon the peacock throne, surrounded by his advisors, listening to a merchant complain about British tariffs. His fingers drummed on the armrest, restless and jittery. He wore a robe of gold-threaded brocade, yet his eyes lay deep in their sockets, and Tariq saw that he had not slept the previous night. Behind the throne, in the half-shadow of a silk curtain, stood Mir Jafar. He carried no weapon. He needed none. His presence alone was a threat that the Nawab seemed unable to perceive. When the merchant had finished, Mir Jafar leaned forward and whispered something into the Nawab's ear. The Nawab nodded distractedly, without raising his gaze. Tariq stepped forward. A guard stopped him with the flat of his hand against his chest. The Nawab has no time for clerks today. Tariq did not retreat. He held out the deciphered sheet to the guard, folded and signed with his own name as a pledge of truth. "It is a matter of life and death," he said, softly enough that only the guard could hear him. "The life and death of the Nawab." The guard hesitated. For a moment, Tariq saw something in his face, not conviction, but the fear of making a mistake that could cost him his head. He took the sheet and carried it to the throne. Mir Jafar saw the messenger approaching. His eyes, dark and still like pond water in the shade, followed the paper, as though he could set it ablaze before it reached its destination. He said something too quietly for Tariq to hear, but the Nawab waved him away. Impatiently, he reached for the sheet. Tariq held his breath. The Nawab skimmed the lines, his brow furrowed. Then, instead of paling or crying out, he laughed, a short barking laugh that echoed in the hall and instantly died away. Another rumor, he said, dropping the sheet. My uncle Mir Jafar is loyal to me. The clerk should mind his own affairs. Mir Jafar smiled. It was the smile of a man who had never doubted. Tariq bent to pick up the sheet, but a servant swept it away before he could reach it. The guard grabbed his arm and pulled him towards the exit. As he left, Tariq saw Mir Jafar watching him, still smiling, and then giving a barely perceptible signal to one of his men. On the street outside the palace, Tariq began to run. Behind him, still hidden in the crowd, two shadows moved into action. The jeweler from Qasim Bazaar was named Arif and was the only person Tariq still trusted. His shop lay in a narrow alley near the river. A slender house that smelled of sandalwood and silver polish. Arif sat behind his workbench, a loop on his nose, polishing a ruby as Tariq entered through the back door, breathless and with the shadow of Mir Jafar still at his neck. "You look as though you have seen a ghost," said Arif, without looking up. "Worse, I have seen the truth." Tariq placed the decrypted copy on the workbench. Arif read it, once, twice, then took off his magnifying spectacles and rubbed his eyes. The silence between them was as heavy as the monsoon, which still had not properly begun. "You are playing a game you cannot win," Arif said finally. "The English have time on their side. They think in decades, we in days. Who do you think will win?" He spoke of rumors swirling through the bazaars of Qasim Bazaar like driftwood before a flood. Clive had promised Mir Jafar not only the throne, but the entire state treasury of Murshidabad. The Nawab was isolated, his own generals seeing in him nothing more than an obstacle. And the company was waiting only for a pretext to strike. Tariq slid the letter across the table to Arif. "If I die, ensure the Nawab receives it." Arif hesitated, then nodded. He took the letter and placed it in an ebony casket, which he concealed beneath a loose floor tile. As a parting gift, he handed Tariq a dagger with a mother-of-pearl handle and the key to a horse tethered behind the house. "Ride fast," said Arif, "and do not ride home." The rain began as Tariq reached the first mangrove groves, not as a gentle veil, but as a lashing curtain that dissolved the world into gray and green. The horse Arif had given him shied at every clap of thunder, forcing Tariq to grip the reins with both hands, his knees pressed into the animal's flanks. Behind him, still invisible but unmistakable, hooves thundered through the mud. They came from the east, 4 riders fanning out across the rice fields. Tariq recognized their silhouettes against the pale sky, Mir Jafar's men, identifiable by their high saddles and the short, curved sabers they had already drawn. He drove his horse west, deeper into the groves, where the branches hung low and visibility shrunk to a few steps. The first attacker caught up with him at a clearing. Tariq heard the whistle of the blade, threw himself flat on his horse's neck, and felt the rush of air over his back. He ripped the dagger from his belt, Arif's dagger, the pearl-handled hilt slick with rain, and stabbed blindly behind him. The blade struck something soft, a stifled cry, then the clatter of a falling body. Tariq did not look back. The 3 remaining riders became more cautious, keeping their distance. Instead, they drove him with shouts and precise strikes in the direction they wanted, south, where the land turned marshy and the horses' hooves sank knee-deep into the mire. Tariq recognized the trap too late. His horse reared, lost its footing, broke through a crusted layer of clay and plunged into the brackish water beneath. He was thrown from the saddle, landed in the mud, and the dagger slipped from his hand. 2 riders circled him while the 3rd held back, securing the escape routes. In the pale light of the lightning, Tariq saw their faces, expressionless, not cruel, merely dutiful. One dismounted, saber held loosely in his right hand. He approached slowly, deliberately, as though he had all the time in the world. Tariq groped for the dagger in the mud, but found it not. Instead, his fingers closed around a fist-sized stone. As the man stood over him, winding up for a blow, Tariq threw himself to the side and slammed the stone against his temple. The man staggered. The saber hissed into the ground. Tariq grabbed the blade, cut his palm, wrenched it from the stunned man and thrust, once, blindly, into the darkness between chest and throat. The rider sank silently into the mud. Tariq stood, the foreign weapon in his bleeding hand, and faced the remaining attackers. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the two turned their horses and disappeared into the rain. Tariq waited until the hoofbeats faded before collapsing. He knelt in the mud, foreign blood mixed with his own, and retched. It took a long time before he could rise again. The wound on his shoulder, which he had not felt during the fall, now throbbed with every heartbeat. He tore a strip of cloth from his garment and bandaged his hand makeshift style. The monsoon washed the dirt from his face, but the feeling of the stone striking bone remained in his fingers, as though the hand possessed a memory that forgot nothing. The river Bhagirathi wound through the flat land like a silver scar, flanked by mango groves that stood heavy and still in the humid air of late June. Plassey was not a place recorded on maps, a village of mud huts, a few wells, a hunting pavilion of the Nawabs of Bengal, long fallen into ruin. Yet here, where the river made a sluggish bend and the bank gave way to a wide plain, the Nawab had pitched his camp. 50,000 men, 40 cannons, and French artillerymen under Monsieur Sinfray, who gathered around the guns like mothers around their children. Tariq reached the camp on the evening of 22nd of June, as the sun sank behind the mango trees like a bloody disc. His horse limped. He himself rode in a fever, the shoulder wound pulsing beneath its makeshift bandage. The guards at the outer post did not recognize him, but they let him pass because he spoke Persian and used the correct names. A mood prevailed in the camp that Tariq could not fathom. Not fear, not battle lust, but a strange paralysis, as if a mighty machine were waiting for an order that never came. He found the Nawab's tent at the center of the camp, a splendid structure of red velvet with golden tassels, surrounded by the banners of the commanders. Through a gap in the tent wall, he saw Siraj-ud-Dawla seated on a field throne, his face etched by sleeplessness, his hands clenched around the pommel of his dagger. Gathered around him stood the men who had already decided his fate, Mir Jafar, whose countenance was as impenetrable as polished marble, Mir Madin, the only one still showing a will to fight, and Rai Durlab, whose gaze kept drifting towards Mir Jafar like compass needles to the North Pole. Tariq tried to step forward, but a hand closed around his arm. It was a guard he knew, Nasir, a man from his quarter, with whom he had drunk tea and argued about horses years ago. Now Nasir looked at him as if seeing right through him. "You do not belong here," he whispered. "They say you work for the English." Tariq wanted to reply, but Nasir shook his head and pulled him away, from the tent, from the Nawab who sat only 20 paces away, unaware of the betrayal that would await him the next morning. He spent the night on the riverbank, hidden among the gnarled roots of a mango tree that was older than the empire yet to be born. The British camp lay less than a half-mile upstream, and when the wind shifted, it carried fragments of voices across the water. Bored officers playing cards, the clinking of tin mugs, once even a short, barking laugh that must have belonged to Clive. These men slept, or they whiled away their time with games, as if no battle loomed on the morrow, but rather a fox hunt in the county of Shropshire. Tariq rested his head against the damp bark and closed his eyes. The fever throbbed in his shoulder, but clearer than the pain was the memory rising unbidden. His father, a pale Englishman with freckles on the backs of his hands, who had given him a compass, the only inheritance he would ever receive. "So you always know where north is," the man had said, and had departed the following morning. Tariq had been 8. He had carried the compass in his pocket ever since, a useless instrument for a boy who belonged nowhere. Now he drew it out, letting the needle dance in the moonlight. North was where the company's ships lay, laden with opium and muskets, and the unshakable belief that the world belonged to them. He thought of his daughter, whom he was to see again in a week and might never see again. He thought of his wife, whose face he had captured in a pencil drawing because he feared he would otherwise forget it. He thought of the Nawab, who would die tomorrow without ever learning that a Persian clerk with forged papers and a broken heart had tried to save him. From his pocket he drew a crumpled sheet of paper, the last sheet he carried, and began to write, smoothing the paper flat on his knees. "Forgive your father. He wanted to speak the truth, but the world would not listen. Keep the compass I send you. It points not only north, but to what once was and what yet might be. Do not forget that you are of both sides. Perhaps one day you will understand that this is no curse, but a key." He folded the letter and tucked it into a waxed cloth pouch, which he addressed to his sister. The first streak of light appeared over the mango trees, pale and hesitant, as if fearing what it would illuminate. Drums began to beat, first sporadically, then in waves that propagated through the Nawab's camp. 50,000 men rose from their bedding, grasping for weapons they would not be able to use. Tariq stood up, his bones heavy, his heart heavier. The river glittered in the early light, as if nothing had happened, as if this were just another morning in Bengal when the world was still in order. Then the first cannon shot roared across the water, and the mango leaves shivered as if under an invisible blow. The cannonade did not begin as a crash, but as a tremor that crept through the ground and took hold in Tariq's chest. From the riverbank, he saw the first volleys flash across the water, saw how the ranks of French artillerymen retreated from their guns and advanced again, men from a distant war, dying for a cause that was not their own. Mir Madan led the first attack. Tariq recognized him by his white horse, which broke through the powder smoke like a ghost from an older time. Behind him, the Bengali cavalry surged forward, 1,000 sabers gleaming in the murky morning light. For a breath, it seemed the battle might still be won. Then a British cannonball struck Mir Madan in the chest, and the man who alone had wanted to fight for the Nawab shattered like a puppet made of cloth and bone. His horse galloped on, empty stirrups clattering, until it disappeared into the smoke. The cavalry hesitated, stalled, then turned. Panic was more contagious than courage, spreading faster than orders could contain it. Tariq watched as officers screamed unheard, as a mighty army dissolved into a swarming chaos of men and animals, unsure of which way to turn. Then the monsoon set in, not as rain but as a wall. The heavens opened, and water poured down as if someone had tipped an ocean over Bengal. Within heartbeats, the Nawab's gunpowder supplies turned to gray sludge. The cannons that had still been firing fell silent. Through the streaming curtain, Tariq saw the British guns, carefully covered with tarred tarpaulins, continue to roar, salvo after salvo, a clockwork of death that no weather could halt. He ran. He did not know where, only away from the river, away from the cannons, into the dying army of the Nawab. All around him, men threw away their weapons, trampled each other, fell into the mud, and did not rise again. A sepoy of the company appeared before him, bayonet red, eyes empty. Tariq threw himself to the side, felt the blade graze his cheek, rolled over bodies still warm, and pulled himself back up. He saw Mir Jafar's troops. They stood on a rise, 1,000 men, 2,000, motionless. They watched as their comrades died and did not move. Tariq screamed into the rain, screaming the word that contained everything, screaming it until his throat burned and his voice broke. Treason, treason. The monsoon swallowed his words, as it swallowed everything that day. Then he saw the Nawab, a small figure on a camel, surrounded by a handful of loyalists who were fighting their way through the chaos. Siraj-ud-Dawla looked back, just once, and in that gaze lay no longer anger, but a wonder that cut deeper than any wound. Then he spurred his beast and vanished into the gray curtain of rain. Tariq stood still. Around him the battle ebbed, because there was nothing left to fight. The army of Bengal had ceased to exist. dissolved into individual men running for their lives. He knelt, his knees in the mud, the blood from the wound on his cheek mingling with the rain, and watched as the red coats of the company slowly advanced across the field, methodical, unstoppable, as if they had all the time in the world. The battle was over, but the dying had not ceased. Looters crawled across the field of Plassey like ants over a fallen elephant, rifling through saddlebags, wrenching rings from fingers, fighting over boots. The rain had stopped, and the sun broke through the parting clouds, as if the sky had decided to expose the misery to merciless light. Tariq walked among the dead, unsure why. His shoulder throbbed, his bandaged hand sticky with his own blood. He was not looking for plunder. He was looking for a reason to keep going. The young officer lay beneath an overturned supply cart, as if he had dragged himself there to die in peace. His red uniform coat was dark with dampness and blood, but beneath it he wore a silk waistcoat embroidered with peacock feathers, a piece of booty that did not conform to the company's strict regulations. His eyes were wide open, staring at a sky they would no longer see. Tariq knelt. In the breast pocket of the waistcoat, he found a watch, heavy and warm, as though it had stored the heartbeat of its owner. He drew it out and recognized it immediately, the two-faced dial, the miniature painting of the peacock and lotus, the verse by Saadi engraved on the silver case. It was the chronometer the Persian clockmaker had presented to the Nawab on that stifling night in May, which now seemed like a different life. The dead officer wore a medallion around his neck, which Tariq opened carefully. Engraved upon it was a name, James Thackeray, Sr. Below it, in smaller script, "May God guide your steps, my son." Tariq closed the medallion and left it resting on the dead man's chest. But he took the watch, not as theft, but as salvage. Something had to remain of that day, something that was not made of blood and ash. He tucked the chronometer into his pocket, stood up, and left the dead Englishman beneath the overturned cart, his face turned to the sky, as if he were still waiting for an answer. The road to Murshidabad was a single fever. Tariq drove his lame horse through the night, the chronometer heavy in his pocket, his shoulder wound pulsing in rhythm with the hoofbeats. Around him, Bengal was falling apart. Villages were burning, fields were trampled, and on the road crowds of refugees jostled together, not knowing where to go. No one paid any attention to a solitary rider in blood-crusting robes. When he reached the city, he hardly recognized it. The bazaars where, as a boy, he had stolen mangoes had been plundered. In front of the great mosque, a crier proclaimed the name of the new Nawab, Mir Jafar, the traitor whom Clive had placed on the throne. Tariq pulled in his head and guided the horse through the side streets, past British sepoy soldiers searching houses, past women crouching weeping in front of locked doors. His sister's house still stood, a narrow building on the edge of the tanning district. He knocked 3 times, short, long, short, the old signal from his childhood. It took a long time before the door opened a crack. His sister, Amina, stared at him as if he were a ghost. "You're alive," she whispered, pulling him inside. In the inner courtyard, a little girl was playing with a cloth doll. She looked up, and Tariq saw his wife's eyes in her face. She did not recognize him immediately. He was emaciated, bearded, his clothes stiff with blood and mud. Then, hesitantly, she smiled. He collapsed onto the carpet before he could even speak her name. Amina tended to his wounds with boiling water and turmeric paste, while he spoke in his fever of the battle, the betrayal, and the watch, which he took from his pocket and placed on the floor. The chronometer ticked quietly, undisturbed. The next morning, with the fever subsided, Tariq knew he could not stay. Mir Jafar's spies were hunting for traitors, and his name was on their lists. He pressed the chronometer into his daughter's small hands and watched as she held it to her ear and laughed. Then he gave Amina the letter and the compass. "Keep both until she is old enough. Tell her who her father was, not the spy, not the scribe, but the man who tried to warn." In the evening he left, into the monsoon that had set in again, and vanished into the mist before his daughter woke. The Nawab fled to Murshidabad that night, but the city that had birthed him offered no protection. With a handful of loyalists, he journeyed further north, through the rain that would not cease, through villages that barred their doors to him. In Patna, he sought refuge with a man he had trusted, a landowner who had once called him friend. It was this friend who handed him over to Mir Jafar's thugs for a handful of rupees and the promise of being left alone. On 4 July 1757, they brought him back to Murshidabad, a captive ruler in a bamboo cage. Mir Jafar's son, a boy scarcely older than the Nawab himself, entered the cell and stabbed him with a dagger paid for by Clive. They dragged the corpse through the streets, past the bazaars where he had played as a child, past the palace where his mother still lived, and threw it onto a cart that took it away. No one knew where. Tariq, learning of this from afar, a whisper traveling through the villages, faster than the company's riders, sat in his hiding place and wept. Not only for the young man who had been his ruler and whom he had failed to save, he wept for a Bengal that vanished forever with that death. For an era that had flickered once more in the ticking of a two-faced chronometer, and now went out. With Siraj-ud-Dawla died the last independent sultanate of Bengal. The time of the company began, and it ticked to a different rhythm, faster, colder, unrelenting as the pistons of the looms in Manchester, already waiting for the first cotton harvest. A year later, in May 1758, Tariq lived in a village near the border with Bihar, one unnamed on the company's maps. He wore the beard of a wandering fakir and the clothes of a man who possessed nothing worth stealing. The shoulder wound had healed, but the fever returned whenever the monsoon set in, and with it came the dreams of Mir Madden's shattering body, of the young officer's eyes staring into a sky they could no longer see, of the saber he had driven into a man's throat. Once a month, when the moon was thin enough, he rode to Murshidabad. He would sit on a hill beyond the tannery quarter and watch his sister's house until dusk fell. Sometimes he saw his daughter playing in the courtyard, a 6-year-old girl speaking to a rag doll as if it were alive. He never went down. Mir Jafar's spies were still searching for the Persian traitor, and his name remained on lists that never expired. One night in late May, he visited Arif. The jeweler of Qasim Bazaar had aged in that year. His hands, which once crafted the most delicate silver filigree, now trembled when he held the hammer. He now worked for Mir Jafar, cutting rubies for the court, and his workshop smelled of the sour sweat of fear. "They have not forgotten your name," Arif said without looking up. "There is a new commander in the city, an uncle of the Nawab. He has sworn to find you before the next monsoon ends." He slid a leather pouch across the table to Tariq, enough rupees for a journey north, perhaps to Delhi, perhaps further. Tariq took the pouch, but his thoughts were on the hill beyond the tannery quarter. "I want to see her one more time," he said. The following evening, as the sun sank behind the mango groves and the air grew heavy with impending rain, he stood on the hill. His daughter sat in the courtyard, the chronometer in her hands. Amina had given it to her, perhaps as a toy, perhaps as a reminder of a father who no longer came. The girl held the watch to her ear, listening to the ticking and laughing, a bright, innocent laugh that cut through the evening like a blade. Tariq whispered into the silence, "One day you will understand what this watch means, and perhaps you will carry it forward if I cannot." He turned away and walked down the hill without looking back. The mist rising from the river swallowed him before he reached the foot. In the courtyard, the girl held the chronometer against the fading light. The dual-faced dial reflected the setting sun of Bengal, and one of the two-time indicators pointed to an hour that had not yet arrived. Then Amina called from the house, and the child ran inside, the watch pressed tight to her chest, as dusk fell over Murshidabad like a curtain slowly descending.